We have a lot of representation from all over the world, so I'm excited to see that. We're getting started just a few seconds late. That's okay though. Hopefully nobody minds. Um, Looks like we have people from Sweden, Canada, Spain, Philadelphia. Not that Philadelphia is a country in and of itself, but it is the city of brotherly love. So we're glad to have you here. And joining me, uh, you can probably see a couple other people joining. We'll give it just one more minute just to make sure we have everybody um, brought in from the waiting room. Sometimes it doesn't dump everybody in equally. While we're waiting, um, if you see anybody from a country nearby you, go ahead and give them a friendly wave with the chat. I don't know if we don't use that very often, but some people get start using those emojis. Feel free to wave to each other if you're close by. This is an opportunity to see others who are around you as well, and maybe a chance for light online networking if that passes. But okay, we're at 9:01. Good to see everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, the live Q&A with FDA cybersecurity pre-market guidance. My name is Etienne Nichols. I'm a medical device guru here at Greenlight Guru, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. Today's webinar is going to run for 60 minutes in total, and we do want to hear from you. Definitely use that chat. On the right side of the screen, you'll see a few tabs there. You'll see the chat and the Q&A. The chat looks like a lot of people have already found that. That's where you can engage with other attendees, post those general comments, say hi to people who are nearby, or maybe some people you've interacted with in the industry before. The Q&A chat or the Q&A tab is where you can ask questions that you want me to ask during the Q&A portion of today's webinar. This is a live Q&A, so we really want you to use that Q&A and definitely want you to find that. So go ahead and use that. Even if you don't have a specific question, go ahead and navigate over to the Q&A throughout the webinar so that you can upvote other questions. If there's a question you feel like is relevant to you, go ahead and upvote that, and we'll try to prioritize the ones that are most relevant to the audience. We always get this question, so we try to always answer it. We will be sharing the full recording and slides with all registrants after the webinar, so keep an eye out for that email from us later today or later this week. I'd like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why, and our co-host Vigilant Ops, and why we put on these free training sessions. Improving the quality of life for our customers and their patients is our mission here at Greenlight Guru. It's likely a similar mission to many of you who are joining us today. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free webinars, partnering with world-class medical device experts like today's presenters, or through our award-winning cloud-based solutions. At Greenlight Guru, our focus is on moving medtech forward. Our solutions are designed to help you streamline your processes so you can navigate the regulatory hurdles and succeed in the market. Our medtech suite provides quality management, product development, and clinical data management solutions designed exclusively for medical devices. So if you're interested in seeing why over 1,100 of the world's leading medtech companies trust Greenlight Guru, head over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation for a personalized demo. Also, our partner Vigilant Ops is aligned with our mission. They've been successfully supporting medical device manufacturers with SBOM, lifecycle management, and compliance for this latest guidance, which we'll be discussing in more detail in just a moment. So definitely want to give a shout out to them for putting this together and inviting our presenters today with us to be with us. Let me give a proper introduction to your presenters. Jessica Wilkerson is a senior cyber policy advisor in the medical device cybersecurity team, lead with all hazards readiness response and cybersecurity ARC team in the CDRH within the FDA. As part of ARC, she examines issues and develops policy related to medical device security. Matthew Hazelett is a cybersecurity policy analyst at FDA. In his role, Matthew is focused on pre-market and post-market cybersecurity policy development and implementation across the clinical review offices. He also serves as the Digital Health Officer of Excellence Program Director for the OPEC Cybersecurity Focal Point Program. And finally, Zen Zalevsky is a certified cybersecurity leader with over 19 years of experience in the medical device industry. He's the founder and CEO of Vigilant Ops and serves as a trusted cybersecurity consultant to healthcare industry stakeholders, including the FDA and Department of Homeland Security. And with that, let's dive into today's presentation and Q&A. So just a little bit more context. Previously, we had a webinar with Jessica Wilkerson on demystifying FDA's pre-market final guidance, And if you're interested in seeing that and watching that, you can go check that on demand with the recording and the slides. We had a lot of questions. I wish I had an actual number for you, but I think it was in the 50s or 60s of questions that we were not able to get to. So we tried to consolidate some of those questions. And so that's what we're going to be discussing a lot today. So let's go dive into the first one, which was, are there specific requirements for AI-enabled devices? And I'm going to hand this over to Matthew or Jessica, probably Matthew to start out, but go ahead.
Sure. So we outline in the guidance how the security objectives in the general principles section can apply to AI-enabled devices. So you're still going to be looking for providing authentication, authorization, confidentiality controls, secure updates to your AI-enabled devices. So you're going to be looking for potential threats that can impact your AI technology that may present differently. So you're going to use your threat modeling and architecture views to evaluate what those potential threats and necessary controls are. And then the control categories in the guidance also are applicable to AI-enabled technology and medical devices. So you'd be looking for what controls are relevant for the different elements of your AI-enabled system, making sure you have secure updates to those software components, and making sure that your inputs are appropriately authenticated, that you have appropriate integrity controls. So very much the recommendations in the guidance still apply to AI-enabled devices, and we're continuing as the center to work on additional AI/ML guidance. So there's the draft guidance on AI/ML-enabled devices on our A list of priorities for the fiscal year that's also coming. So very much AI still fits within the guidance framework, but there may be specific threats and additional controls that you would want to consider for that technology.
Very cool. And I'm already loving the Q&A that's popping up. So we're going to go through these, and I'm excited to get to the actual questions though as well. Anything to add from Jessica or Ken?
Nothing here.
All right. So the next question we got was on CVE reports and statistics that can be supplied. What level of detail is needed for CVEs unpatched but mitigated on the device? For example, hardening and configuration. And I'm going to call on Matthew again as well, unless someone else wants to hit the buzzer.
Sure. So with CVE reports, that's really going to be captured in the vulnerability assessments that are provided in addition to the software bill of materials. And as a part of those assessments, you should be providing details on what existing controls in the device would mitigate that vulnerability or make it something where it couldn't cause an impact. So you should be providing specifics around exactly what in the device provides that level of control to address the vulnerability if you're not making an update to patch to a new version that removes the vulnerability. We do see oftentimes that some of those assessments just state that the device has controls to mitigate those, and you're likely to get a deficiency to ask for more specific details around what controls in the device protect against those vulnerabilities.
Okay.
So is it, this is Ken, real quick, Matt, is it safe to say then, and I think by the way the question was worded with, they give the examples of hardening and configuration, it sounds like more details about the mitigation of the vulnerability are better, is what you're saying.
Yeah. And those are also things that can be captured in the threat modeling and risk assessment architecture views in terms of what controls address those particular risks that are identified from third-party vulnerabilities or general vulnerabilities in the device. But greater specifics are always better and more useful in the cybersecurity review process. This is an area where the details matter in terms of being able to actually come to agreement on whether those statements truly address the risk. So while we know in certain disciplines of the review area, manufacturers are hesitant to provide additional details as that can give greater questions. In cybersecurity, a lack of detail is going to get you greater questions. More details, better.
Thank you. Yep.
Appreciate you. That makes sense, and I appreciate you following up with that question, Ken. Okay, we'll keep moving. So one of the third questions was, where does cybersecurity fit into the software lifecycle? I assume TPLC, total product lifecycle.
Sure, I can start out on this one and then have Matt chime in with anything more specific from the reviewer perspective. But in terms of where does cybersecurity fit into the software lifecycle, TPLC, everywhere. Throughout. If you're going to have effective cybersecurity as is described in our guidance, you really have to design it in from the absolute beginning. Your software, your architecture, the way that your device is going to function has to be considered from the beginning. We have seen over and over again that attempting to integrate cybersecurity later into the TPLC is not nearly as effective and sometimes is just ineffective. Because the design considerations that have already been built prevent the security controls from working as well. So in terms of the design process, it has to be considered at the beginning. And then, and sometimes I think that this gets a little bit forgotten about, once you've passed an FDA review, it doesn't end. You have post-market cybersecurity responsibilities that have to be maintained and considered, including keeping the device updated, especially if you are a cyber device, since that is now required by law. But if there is an incident, if there is a vulnerability, if there needs to be some kind of update to the way that the device works or is designed in order to guard from cybersecurity threats, the cybersecurity comes throughout the entire TPLC.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little bit. So you want to make sure that your cybersecurity considerations are early in the process, as that can help inform which third-party software components you select to integrate into the device based off of their support lifecycle, based off of the potential risks those introduce. We see a lot of manufacturers trying to pass the buck onto their third-party component suppliers around whether things are supported or whether potential risks are introduced. But at the end of the day, you as the medical device manufacturer are making the selections of those components and are responsible for the overall risk profile of the device. So by bringing those cybersecurity considerations of those components early into your design development considerations can help throughout the life cycle of the device result in a more secure product and be able to be better positioned to manage emerging vulnerabilities that can affect those components.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'd like to jump in and add a little to that. So thank you, Jessica and Matt. Both great answers, and I think I couldn't agree more with the remark Jessica made at the beginning that belongs everywhere. I mean, I think part of the genesis from this question, or where this question comes from in industry, I think is a little bit of confusion around maybe security framework versus safety framework. I mean, we are all, in the med device space, we all know the safety framework. We've been around that for many, many years. I think we're still in industry, still grappling with security and how that aligns. And so I think going back to, exactly what you said, thinking about those processes, safety is certainly different from security, but they both, at the end of the day, impact patient safety. And so the idea is to kind of bake that in early on. And then I love that evergreen comment that it's continuous. So, as you get through your development life cycle and as you release more secure product, maintaining that then becomes super critical. So I think that, as I said, I think the genesis of this is just that grappling with the alignment. And I think FDA does a great job in the guidance talking about the secure product development framework and multiple frameworks that you can use as examples as well. So thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take a quick break real quick and just open a poll just to see where we're at with this. I'm curious where everybody is on their go-to-market journey. So if you have a chance, answer this poll. This might be able to help us in some of the answers and how we're answering these things. So the question is, where are you on your go-to-market journey? Are you preparing for a submission now? Have you already submitted and waiting for feedback? Or is the third one, you're not ready for a submission, you're here to learn and prepare for the future? Looks like the majority are not ready for a submission yet, but kind of evenly split between preparing for a submission and not ready for one. I guess the people who have already submitted just have to roll the dice and let it ride. But if you could just let it for a few more seconds. We have 61 votes saying they're preparing for submission now, 70 saying they're not ready for submission, and about 24 have already submitted and are waiting for feedback. Okay, so just to give you an idea where people are in the lifecycle journey. And we have another poll coming up, but thank you for answering that one. It helps us kind of understand where we're at and where we're going. Okay, let's get back to the next question, which is, do these FDA requirements align with IEC 81001, health software and health IT systems, safety, effectiveness, and security, which is now mandatory for medical devices in the EU? Do you want to comment on that, Matthew?
Sure. So we actually reference 81001-5-1 as a secure product development framework that we know is available. So it is largely aligned. I will say the FDA guidance goes into more detail around some of what the end deliverable should look like, and some of the specifics around the types of things to include in some of the deliverables, like the architecture reviews or what control considerations to apply. But the overall document is very much in alignment with this standard. So complying with it for other jurisdictions should still work, but we are still looking for the level of detail in all of the documentation deliverables that are outlined in our guidance.
And Ken, I don't know if you want to comment on just the practical side of putting these things in place, or adhering to both from an industry perspective. Do you have any comment or any thoughts?
One thing, I will say this, and even beyond the EU. So I understand this question is kind of saying, well, alignment with 81001, which, as Matt pointed out, is part of the guidance and a reference in the guidance. But there's also an indication and a reference in the guidance to the IMDRF, International Medical Device Regulators Forum, documentation as well. So beyond even just 81001, there are other things to look at with respect to frameworks that FDA has done a good job aligning with. So, I would suggest folks that have global reach and are looking commercially globally should take a look at those documents as well, in addition to 81001 and some of the standards that are out there today.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, let's go to the next question then. And I think this is the last one that we have officially, and then we can get to the ones that are in our Q&A. But as this guidance is for 510Ks moving forward, what's the guidance for devices that are currently in the marketplace, legacy medical devices? Do they get a pass, or what's the comment there?
So just starting off, so the requirements for Section 524B apply to all prospective submissions. So if you're going to be making any modifications to any existing devices and coming back into the agency with a new pre-market submission, the new requirements apply, and we would be looking for all of the documentation outlined in the latest version of the guidance from September of last year. For devices that are on the market but not coming back in for submissions, we still have our post-market guidance, which outlines how we expect cybersecurity risk management to occur in the post-market space. So complaint handling, MDR reporting, recalls for identified unacceptable risks still apply to manufacturers for devices that are still in the field or being marketed. but might not be coming back in for updates. But I do also want to pass it over to Jessica for some discussion on some of our larger legacy efforts as well.
Thanks. Yes. So for those of you who have attended other FDA talks or have participated in some of the other legacy work that FDA has done, you know that legacy is very much a focus of ours. And so as Matt said, 524B in particular is for prospective device types going forward. It is not for devices that had previously been cleared, but do legacy medical devices get a pass? No. And they had not previously gotten a pass, right? So I know there is a temptation to split the world into prior to 524B and after 524B, and after 524B is the only thing that matters from a cybersecurity perspective, but that's not accurate, right? The first FDA guidance on pre-market cybersecurity came out in 2014. Medical devices were being reviewed for cybersecurity through that, and even post that, prior to that, right? There was the first guidance addressing off-the-shelf software concerns was in 2005. So this has been for many decades. FDA has been looking at this. Are we going to be completely upfront and honest that we know that the considerations and the reviews have gotten more stringent over time? Yes, absolutely. The screws have been tightening, but the cybersecurity was being considered prior to 524B is certainly strengthened with 524B. But as Matt said, the post-market guidance also comes into consideration here, right? Like if there is a vulnerability or in some kind of incident with a device that was pre-524B, we expect and will work with the medical device manufacturers to appropriately manage that risk. It doesn't matter that the device was cleared prior to 524B. And so we do want everybody to understand that 524B is an incredibly important milestone within FDA's regulation of medical devices. It is not the only thing that matters. It was not the beginning of FDA's medical device cybersecurity program. It is not the only thing that influences it. And so I think we're going to get into this a little bit in the Q&A, but I think it's important to address this here just because of the way that the question is framed, right? It says, as this guidance is for 510Ks moving forward. That's not accurate. The guidance is not just for 510Ks moving forward. The guidance is for multiple types of devices. So be very, very careful about how you are reading it, because if you think that you are not a 510K, so you're somehow out of scope of this, you're going to have a very rough time. The other thing that we like to point out, because we've seen this start to be something that manufacturers are considering, just because you are not a cyber device, just because you fall out of the scope of 524B, doesn't mean you are out of scope of having to do cybersecurity for your medical device. If you fall out of scope of the cyber guidance, the cyber device definition, you probably fall right into the scope of the pre-market cybersecurity guidance, which have pretty much the same considerations, the same documentation recommendations and everything. So I would just recommend that everybody be very thoughtful and be very, very careful about how you are reading these documents, because the nuance and the specific words on the page matter.
Yeah, those are great comments, Jessica and Matt, and certainly appreciate that. Makes a tremendous amount of sense. I think as I read the question and as I think about it more, and I think about the pre-market and post-market opportunities, I think if you look at the pre-market guidance, and I'll throw maybe another question out here, but look at the pre-market guidance again from an industry perspective. There's a mention of a plan to monitor vulnerabilities after the device is marketed. So you're kind of mixing in a sense the post-market stuff is kind of already involved in kind of the pre-market stuff, and I think which makes a lot of sense. Again, you want to plan that ahead of time so you know how you're going to respond to vulnerabilities. Can't do that on the fly. I mean, you can, but it's not efficient and not effective. So I mean, going back to Jessica's point, and this is where I was getting at the question, is it sounds like it's a good idea, even if you're thinking about yourself as a device that's already on the market, to have that plan to monitor vulnerabilities, because we all know vulnerabilities pop up continuously, pop up everywhere. Devices aren't immune to those vulnerabilities. So having an idea and a plan put together already to monitor devices in the field is something that I think is a good recommendation. And again, going back to Jessica's point, when a vulnerability does hit, having that as a leg to stand on makes a lot of sense. And I just throw that out there. Does that make sense from an FDA perspective? Is that a good recommendation for industry to, let's say?
Yep, I would say so. Assuming Matt agrees, but I'm pretty sure he does.
Yes, absolutely.
Very cool. So I'm not going to say I lied. I was mistaken on how many questions we have. Two more. So question number 6: are there FDA expectations on the time frame from exploit discovery to patch completed in the field, or are those timeframes coming?
So from a cybersecurity exploit, the expectation is that's as soon as possible. So from the time you identify that, you should be working as quickly as possible to restore the device functionality, the device operation, if a cybersecurity incident has occurred and impacted the device functionality. So there's no set that should be done in this many number of days. It should be absolutely as soon as possible that you're able to restore that functionality. For vulnerabilities, the post-market guidance has recommendations around communicating to users within 30 days and making updates available within 60. But again, that's going to depend based off of your risk and the architecture of the device. So for cloud-based software, those environments are much more dynamic and change more rapidly. So you may have to have a more rapid patching cycle for that type of software as compared to an embedded implanted device. Those update cycles might be different. And they should always be driven based off of the risk of the nature of the vulnerability or the exploit in terms of how the question was framed, but should be risk informed, but also if it's an unacceptable level of risk, you should be moving as quickly as possible to make those updates. And the overall expectations when you're making your cybersecurity management plans for what types of timelines you'll be making updates, either for routine patches or critical patches, should be based off of the risk elements of the architecture and what the appropriate patching cycles are for those.
So I hesitate to ask this because I think you already answered it with using a risk-based approach, and it's going to depend on the risk of the model. But I'm likely expecting someone in the audience to be thinking of this the opposite way. So okay, so as soon as possible makes sense, and I totally understand why we would say that. Are there any, you get past this certain time frame and that's concerning? The reason I hesitate to ask this is I would not want someone to say, well, I'm going to wait until then to do it. But what are your thoughts? Can you answer it from the kind of a reverse engineering approach? Any thoughts there?
I mean, that's also going to be a risk-based perspective of what the device is, what it means for that device to be down for that amount of time. There's going to be different considerations based off of what the device is doing and how critical it is to patient care. So there's no hard set necessarily cutoff limit for when additional regulatory concern may apply for failure to move quickly. I will say there is a difference between as soon as possible and as soon as convenient. As we know, the medical device manufacturers have a number of different products oftentimes, are doing a lot of things, both in terms of development and maintenance. But when you have a critical issue, that really is something that needs to be addressed as quickly as possible in order to restore that functionality or to mitigate or eliminate the potential newly identified risk. I will also point out, so we work closely and helped co-chair a group in the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council. They released version 2.0 of the Joint Security Plan for medical devices in the past couple of weeks. That document also has a table of best practices for different elements of the architecture and how quickly routine patches should be applied for those types of patching cycles. So there are some best practice recommendations available for the medical device sector through that document currently, and might be a potential resource if trying to calibrate your internal processes or trying to align with what was identified by the public-private partnership, including other medical device manufacturers, in terms of what they think reasonable update cycles are. That might be a good place to start in terms of calibrating or framing what you would want to consider for your own devices.
Fantastic. Any
Yeah,
addition?
and if I may just add a little to that, I mean, just a little nuance again from the perspective of industry, maybe another thing to pay attention to. And I think FDA makes this distinction as well with respect to patching and devices that are in the field. We all know that most of the time, depending on the number of devices in the field, so the footprint of the devices and the reach and the ability to get to those virtually, not all devices will be patched at the same time. And so you'll have devices in various stages and just a natural part of the life cycle. So that's also something that you can keep in mind as a manufacturer to plan for that as well. So you'll want to know how quickly you can get out there and patch devices. That's one thing, but how quickly can you get out there and patch all the devices that are fielded? And what's that gap in between? What does that look like from a risk profile perspective? So again, a little nuance, but something to keep in mind and something that is called out as part of that plan.
Okay. Very cool. Thank you for answering that and humoring me with my reverse question there. So if we go to the next one, question number 7, this is the last one that we have that's official, I suppose. Not much guidance is provided in the post-market guidance for CVD. It says refer to the recognized standard. Could you briefly go over what FDA will specifically look for?
So I'd say from a coordinated vulnerability disclosure perspective, there are the standards available as referenced in terms of what some of those elements are. The select update to the pre-market guidance also that was released in draft a couple of weeks ago also goes into more around what FDA considers in terms of coordinated vulnerability disclosure and related procedures that's identified in the 524B requirements. It's not just for vulnerabilities that were identified by third-party researchers or external. It applies for vulnerabilities that you're identifying yourselves in your products. We want to make sure that users are aware of potential new risks and what they should be doing to mitigate those risks. So you should have a public access in order to report vulnerabilities in as part of your coordinated vulnerability disclosure process. There should be an accessible means for people to contact you to identify any potential vulnerabilities in your products. And then you should have internal procedures that define how you're going to intake those, assess them for what their potential risks are, and how you'll go about communicating and remediating the vulnerabilities depending on the level of risk. I will just point out, as a part of general vulnerability processes, there is a common misconception in the post-market guidance that if you assess the vulnerability as controlled, that you never have to patch it. That is not what the guidance says. It says that those don't have to be patched at the same criticality or urgency as uncontrolled vulnerabilities, but you are still expected to have routine patches that address those lower risk vulnerabilities so that you don't continue to accumulate technical debt in the system that can make future patching efforts harder if you fall multiple versions behind on individual software components. So just because a individual vulnerability is identified as controlled in consistency with the post-market guidance, you should still be making efforts to apply those patches to remove that technical debt from the system before something either exploits that and causes a potential impact, or an additional vulnerability may change what that vulnerability allows in terms of impact.
Okay, fantastic. Any additional comments there? This lasts of the questions that we had for slides. All right. If not, we'll take the live audience questions. But before we do, last time in the last webinar, we had a lot of questions about SBOM. So I wanted to see if we had a similar cross-section of audience. So I'm going to open another poll. What is your experience with SBOMs? Still learning about SBOMs? We create SBOMs manually. We have automation, or our devices do not include software, which is probably going to be the minority, I'm assuming. But if you see that, go ahead and vote, and that will help us understand a little bit about the audience as well. So it looks like the majority are still learning about SBOMs with 63 votes for that, 30 creating SBOMs manually, and about 18 with automation for SBOMs. So I guess I would say 70% still learning, 20% with automation. Maybe that's accurate. Okay, let's give it another couple seconds. Go ahead and vote if you like. Okay, I'll close that out. So for the Q&A, let's see here. I had one that kind of stuck out to me, and we're going to get, if you want to go over to the Q&A, go ahead and check those out and see if there are any that you want to upvote. I'm going to share this one from Samuel Laforestier, if I'm saying that name correctly. Could you confirm that the draft of select updates for the pre-market cybersecurity guidance section 524B of the FD&C Act is excluding 510K exempt medical devices to comply with the new cybersecurity requirements defined in September by FDA, maybe with the exception of not being a cyber device?
Sure. So the 524B requirements, the way how the law was written, it applies to manufacturers that are going to be making 510K, de novo, PMA, humanitarian device exemption, or product development protocol submission to the agency. So if you don't fall into those submission types, the 524B requirements would not apply. However, the guidance still does, because the guidance criteria is based off of whether the device has software, firmware, or programmable logic. So even though there might not be a statutory requirement, the guidance recommendations, including the quality system recommendations, still apply. I will point out we didn't add in all of the quality system regulation references for the fun of it. We do believe that those are important aspects to integrate into the quality system in terms of the development of your device design and are fair game in an inspection. So even if you're not a cyber device and fall under the 524B requirements, those quality system recommendations still apply, and you should still be generating the same types of documentation deliverables as identified in the guidance in order to make sure that you're in compliance with how FDA recommends you to follow the quality system regulations.
Okay. Anything to add from anyone, or? I had another one, and forgive me, those of you listening, if I go a little bit out of order. I found some that I feel like are maybe better or more relevant to a broad audience. So I'm going to stop doing this in just a minute. But Marion asked the question: can you elaborate on the response? Will be generally considered inaccurate if the OS is unsupported or close to end of support. Is it really a no-go even if there's a remediation plan in place?
Yeah, so this is in reference to the eStar template for 510K submissions and some other submission types where we've made it available. So in the eStar template for the cybersecurity section, there's a question asking manufacturers to provide what operating system they're using, the version, and whether it's supported. Largely, as the statement says, generally, if you're coming in with a new device or potentially a modified device and you have a unsupported operating system, that is grounds for us to put the submission on a technical screen hold. So the agency wouldn't accept the submission for substantive review at that point because of the concerns of what having an unsupported operating system means to the overall healthcare environment, the overall ability to support and address emerging vulnerabilities. So typically, if it's unsupported or close to the end of support, you can start to expect to see your submission put on hold until you come back with a supported operating system in order for us to start our substantive review of your submission. We don't really take remediation plans. That's kind of a promissory note of future updates that you're going to be making, and that's really just a non-starter in many cases, unless there's extenuating circumstances or something where it's an existing device in the field where potentially delaying access to updates could cause a concern for patient care. But definitely for new products and for devices that are reasonably expected to still be supported, that's very much something that the agency will be using moving forward in order to make sure that we're only spending the time doing the substantive review on submissions that are well prepared. And that's really a strong indicator of whether a individual device is ready for that deeper substantive review.
Okay. Fantastic answer. Always appreciate the detail. Very cool. Ben asked the question. So this is more for our minority in the audience who may not necessarily have software, but they're curious about this. Ben asked if a device is not intended to have any software updates, maintenance, calibration, software analysis in the field, would it be acceptable to state that PMS analysis is not able to be undertaken specifically to evaluate software vulnerabilities?
So unless it's something where it's a single-use device and that truly an update capability is not expected and that your plans would be to have, if a vulnerability was identified or a particular issue with the cybersecurity of the device was identified, that your plan is to recall and remove the product from the field, that is pretty much the only way to get a device through that has no update capability. For anything that meets the definition of a cyber device that has connectivity, it is part of the statutory requirement that the device is updatable. So really, there's only very few edge cases that could actually yield a software product being authorized that doesn't have an update capability. And that would be contingent on you having the plan and the understanding that if an issue is identified, your only recourse in that action is to remove the product from the field.
Okay. Very cool. Thank you. Anything to add for those? I saw Jessica came off mute.
If I did, that was an accident because
Okay.
that was a perfect answer.
Just trying to be inclusive. Okay. Megan asked the question, when a device, this is the most upvoted one, so I want to ask this one. When a device is not network enabled or connected, but has a USB port on the board for manufacturing purposes, and the device is protected by mechanically sealed housing, must be physically broken to be accessed, is pen testing going to be required?
So this one gets into one of those gray areas. So it really comes down to how that enclosure is sealed. Again, this kind of raises that whole whether the device is updatable and what your strategy is for if there is an issue with the product once it's in the field. So it's one of those that's a choice of the manufacturer not to have access to have updates available, and that is a business risk that you have to consider in terms of your overall device lifecycle management. We do see a lot of instances where Manufacturers state that they have a USB port that's either inside the enclosure or in a service port and only accessible by service personnel, but it's used to perform updates or perform servicing activities. Those are still in scope of being a cyber device. In terms of pen testing, that's something where generally for all devices with software, we would generally expect you to evaluate through penetration testing. Obviously, that might be a more limited engagement if you don't have more exposed interfaces. It's going to be a shorter evaluation by a penetration test house of the product, but that really is the validation of your cybersecurity against current threats. So we do strongly believe that penetration testing should be performed on devices that have software, firmware, or programmable logic. There might be instances where you would be able to provide some justification based off of other testing performed in this unique instance posed in the question, but by and large, penetration testing is a part of our recommendations for any device that has software, firmware, or programmable logic.
And Ken, I might be interested in bringing you into the conversation to get your thoughts on. It looked like you may have been about to say something anyway.
Yeah, thank you, Etienne. Yeah, no, I was just going to say that was a great answer from Matt. And I was going to say it's probably also helpful for manufacturers to think about all devices have risk. So, whether it's, as we just discussed, it's a USB port is not available, it's a service port only, or whatever the discussion is, it's sealed, it's not accessible, but there's still risk in every device that's deployed. And so that's something to keep in mind. It's not a good answer to say there's no risk in this product, right? I mean, we know every product has risk. And so if you get that mindset and start to think that way about all your products, then you can kind of determine where and what level and how to prioritize those in terms of risk management. But again, the thing to keep in mind as a manufacturer is all products have risk.
Okay. Now, I'm glad you brought that up. And I'm actually going to jump down to a question that you just made me think of from Radek Lupusnik, if I'm saying the name correctly. Can we get back to the definition of the cyber device per the newest guidance draft? It's extremely broad definition, captures anything, including the coffee maker, life supporting device. For me, I don't know, that caught my attention. It's same here. Is that indeed the objective? I don't know if you want to comment on that. Yeah, just some of the thinking behind that.
Sure. So in order to be a cyber device, you have to first be a medical device in accordance with Section 201H of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So you first have to meet the definition of a medical device. And then it's the consideration of, are you also now considered a cyber device based off of your consideration? So definitely coffee makers, I also rely on them. It's life supporting for me, but would not fall into scope of the 524B requirements in that way. The interpretation that's provided in the select update is reflective of our considerations for that term of ability to connect to the internet. So we do look for the full evaluation of the threat surface. So looking at not just what the subject device might be doing in terms of connectivity, but what it also interfaces with. So you have a lot of SAMD products that by themselves are only software, but they're going to run on a commercial operating system or mobile phone or tablet. Those are still going to be considered cyber devices because through the evaluation of the overall system in which that device operates, there is still that ability to connect. Similarly, any wireless or wired interfaces, including USB ports, still fall into that scope because of their potential ability, whether intended or not, or whether designed as such, still have that ability for software configuration changes to enable that greater connectivity. So we do look very broadly at the overall threat surface. and looking at those potential unintentional factors that can change the potential device state in terms of whether it actually connects or has that ability to connect. So we do look very broadly. We are also going to be doing a webinar on April 30th as well on the Select update, where we can also answer more specific questions on anything included in the Select update as well.
Okay. A great answer, and I love that phraseology of the threat, the threat area, the surface area, I guess, of the threats. So, speaking of that, I think it's maybe relevant to ask this question: when a software as a medical device is intended to be installed on an open hardware platform like a client-owned PC, how is the cybersecurity responsibility divided between the manufacturer and user?
Great. So I'm going to start us out here, give some high-level remarks and point to some resources that are available, and then turn it to Matt for anything he would want to add. So I think the thing to think about when you are trying to figure out the responsibilities between manufacturer and user is I would start from as maybe, whatever as this sounds, a common sense perspective rather than from a specific framework perspective. Because the bottom line is the cybersecurity responsibilities need to be divided between manufacturer and user in such a way that they can actually be effective and they can actually be implemented in a realistic, resource efficient manner. So what I mean when I say this kind of thing is going to a healthcare delivery organization, putting forward a product that says, in order to keep this medical device secure, it is your responsibility, user, that this thing never gets connected, or that this thing never gets updated, or that this thing does, other controls or whatever that make this completely useless to actually do its intended purpose and actually work within a healthcare environment. That is not an effective distribution of responsibilities. Another example is making sure that updates are available in a timely manner. There are only so many things that a healthcare delivery organization can do to protect devices without actually just patching an issue or getting rid of it altogether, especially considering clinical workflows and other considerations like that. So it is the manufacturer's responsibility to make sure that updates are available in a timely manner so that those can be applied by the customer. As pointed out in some of the other questions, a lot of manufacturers, you're not going to have control over whether or not the healthcare delivery organization actually puts the patch onto the device. But if you don't make the patch available and the HDO doesn't have it to put on the device, that part is on you. And then finally, we go back to this consideration of designing secure devices. If you have designed a device that is just impractical or infeasible to be able to secure, that's not on the customer that they weren't able to properly secure it. That is on you as the medical device manufacturer to need to iterate on your design so that the cybersecurity is designed in from the beginning. And one thing that we have learned, especially with our experience working with the industry and some of the forums that we collaborate in, keep in mind that designing a perfectly secure medical device that's when it sits on the warehouse and it hasn't yet been implemented in an environment, designing a secure medical device is not the same thing as designing a medical device that can be implemented securely. And you need to do both. If the device cannot be implemented securely, that is not a cybersecure device. And that's something that you will see as well as starting to be reflected in the way that FDA reviews devices for cybersecurity. Is if it seems like the maintenance and the ability to implement the device in a cybersecure manner is not present, then we may not consider that to actually be cybersecure. So in terms of looking at potential resources, I would look at the Health Sector Coordinating Council's resources on this. The Managing Legacy Technology Security document talks a lot about this. The model contracts language goes into how to incorporate some of these responsibilities into contracts, as well as the vulnerability communications materials and so on. So I would recommend looking at the HSCC as well. But Matt, anything that you would want to add there?
Sure. Just thinking specifically around the open hardware platform. So if you don't have control over the operating platform that your device is operating on, you're going to have different risks that you need to consider and control for. So there's a difference in how you need to consider those cybersecurity risks because it's reasonably foreseeable that your labeling recommendations around how they're supposed to secure that platform aren't going to be followed. So you now have reasonably foreseeable risks that you also have to figure out how to put controls within the device operation that are able to address those. So it's definitely a decision point in the development of a device in terms of whether you want to go the SAMD approach on an open platform in terms of whether that's a mobile device or a commercial operating system. In terms of PC operations, it's a decision point between whether you want to be the one with greater ability to control that environment or whether you want to go into the open environment of what the hospital is going to have available. And then you're going to have to figure out what controls you put in place. Whether when your software runs, whether you're checking the operating system versions to make sure it's compatible with your version that's running, whether you're doing root or jailbreak detection on mobile devices or on leveraging some of the operating systems logging capabilities and having your software query those statuses to make sure that the device is still considered secure. So there's going to be a trade-off of how many controls you have to integrate in that SAMD product if you're going the open hardware route.
Okay. So we're basically out of time. There's one last question. If we can get a very short answer, maybe even a yes or no, are there any publicly available examples of cybersecurity documentation submissions that have been accepted by the FDA or at least thought to be compliant?
Very short answer is no. So I do know that there are instances where some submissions get FOIA'd, a lot of through the Freedom of Information Act. There's a very long delay in that process, so I don't think anything that has come in since the release of the guidance has gone through, and a lot of the cybersecurity information will be redacted based off of CCI considerations around that being proprietary information to the manufacturer.
Okay.
So I don't think there's much available. I will say, by and large, a number of submissions are getting cybersecurity deficiencies, and several of them throughout the process, as this definitely is a maturation process, both on the agency side and in the industry side, of really getting to a new, better, well-defined and better controlled state on medical device cybersecurity. So I think good examples are still in the process of kind of coming to fruition in order to get that greater clarity, but nothing currently available in terms of examples that I'm aware of, at least at this point.
I'll throw two things out there just for reference to those of the audience. Eric Henry's working with the AFTO RAPS group to put together a submission. It's one of their projects with the AFTO RAPS to put together, I believe it's an AI ideal submission maybe, and I don't know if you all have, no need to comment on it or anything, but that might be something to look at or look for later on this year. I know that's one of their projects anyway. The second thing is, Jessica, your cat is famous now. Everybody loves it. He or she, I don't know. But
sometimes it's easier to just let her do her thing.
Yeah, no, that's great. We're at time. Thank you so much for the informative presentation. Matthew, Jessica, Ken, really appreciate this. All the valuable insights. So those of you who we were not able to answer your questions, there's always more questions that we're able to answer, always more questions than time. But we will be sending you today's recording and the presentation slides, and we'll present these questions back to Matthew and Jessica. Maybe we can collaborate maybe on maybe perhaps a written article from Greenlight Guru or Vigilant Ops, but look out for that and let us know what you'd like to see in the future. But everybody, will let you get back to it. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone. Thank you, Jessica and Matt. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Etienne. Take care,
everybody.